On the 17th of November 1986, the White Sands Ranger Station duty log had the standard entry. Carter received Clark's personal effects for shipment to relatives, but among the old compasses and faded field diaries lay a military map from 1955. On the back was a message addressed to him personally. Daniel Carter, 38, Ranger 2nd Class. He was known in the park as a silent loner who favored the remote routes of the western frontier. 8 years in the Marines had taught him discipline and patience, but few knew why the former Marine really came to White Sands. In 1952, his older brother Thomas, a medical lieutenant, volunteered for an endurance enhancement program at White Sands Missile Range. After a series of experimental injections, he was placed in a closed hospital, and a month later the military informed the family that he had escaped. The search was called off, and the case was closed. Dan didn't believe it. Years of information gathering had brought him here, to the border between a national park and America's most secret military facility, White Sands. 275 square miles of snow-white gypsum dunes between the San Andres and Sacramento ranges. Trinity's first atomic explosion 60 miles to the north. Hundreds of missile tests, closed zones, military patrols along the borders. The western sector of the park is a special place. Here the dunes meet the San Andres foothills, old mines and abandoned military roads, an area that other rangers avoid. A map lay on the table. A military topographical survey dated July 1955. In the J14 quadrant, among the elevation marks and military roads, a neat badge and a signature in pencil. Hangar 18. On the back is a cryptic note from an unknown person. Daniel, I knew you'd come for the truth. I'm leaving you the coordinates. Your brother was on list number 7. Be careful of me. November 1986, 5:47 a.m. Dan Carter turned off the engine of a utility jeep 3 miles from the target coordinates. The thermometer read 4 degrees Celsius. In the pre-dawn desert, any sound traveled for miles. It would have to be on foot from here. The military GPS was pointing at the western boundary of White Sands National Park. Here, the white gypsum dunes transitioned smoothly into the rocky foothills of the San Andres Range. The boundary between the park and the military training ground was blurred and in some places not marked at all, an ideal place to hide a secret facility. The coordinates led Dan to a low rock formation, ordinary weathered rocks of reddish sandstone, like hundreds of them in the desert. The systematic search took over an hour. The sun had already risen above the horizon when Dan noticed an unnaturally neat pile of rocks and dry branches under an overhanging rock canopy. Behind the disguise was a ventilation shaft, a square hole about 1 meter by 1 meter, covered by a massive grate. The metal was rusted, but the structure was solid. The padlock still bore the embossed letters, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, 1951. Cold air with the smell of machine oil and old concrete wafted from the depths. Somewhere down below, machinery hummed monotonously, either fans or a generator. Near the entrance, Dan found fresh Army boot prints, a distinctive tread pattern, clear prints no more than 2 days old, and the butt of a filtered Marlboro cigarette. Unusual, the military traditionally prefer Camel without a filter. Dan used an Army multi-tool to saw through the shackle of the lock. The hardened steel didn't give in immediately. The job took about 20 minutes. The grate opened with a long creak. The concrete shaft went down at a 30-degree angle. There were rusty drips on the walls and metal braces every 1.5 meters. Some were wobbling, but most were holding firmly. For the first 15 meters, the descent was relatively gentle. Then there were signs in black paint: closed zone, authorized personnel only, radiation danger, and below, almost erased by time, the notice, Object 18, Level 1. Suddenly there came the murmur of diesel engines from above. Dan switched off his torch and quickly made his way up to the exit. 100 meters from his position, 2 sand-colored Army Humvees stopped. No identification marks, the license plates painted over. 4 military men in camouflage without stripes began to circle the area. The wind carried scraps of conversation. The junior was reporting a clean perimeter and non-functioning sensors. The commander had ordered increased patrols after the Clark incident. His last words were particularly clear. If you find any intruders, act without warning. The facility is officially defunct. He repeated the phrase twice. One of the soldiers headed toward the rock where Dan was hiding. He stopped 20 paces away, looked around. Dan pressed himself against the rocks, holding his breath. The soldier stood for another minute, then turned around, tossing something about coyotes. The patrol loaded into cars and drove away. Dan waited another 15 minutes before returning to the mine. Now the situation was clear. The site was secure, the military knew about it. But why hadn't the cut lock been replaced? The answer was around the corner of the tunnel. A massive steel door with a state-of-the-art electronic lock completely blocked the passage. A red light signaled that it was locked. To the left of the door, an old army toolbox stood in a niche. Inside, instead of tools, there were folders with documents. The covers were labeled "Totally Secret." The first photograph is a black and white group shot. 12 people in white coats against a concrete wall. The caption at the bottom, "Medical personnel of the HANGAR 18 project, July 1952, White Sands Proving Ground." In the front row, third from the left, is a young officer with lieutenant's badges on his coat collar. Thomas Carter, Dan's older brother. Dan spent the next hour going through the paperwork. Medical records with numbers instead of names, experiment protocols, radiation tolerance study, testing of MK series psychotropic drugs, long-term effects of combined exposure. Behind the dry scientific language were human lives. Volunteer soldiers who were promised they could help America win the Cold War. A program to create super soldiers capable of surviving a nuclear conflict. A separate folder contained photographs from various years. Underground laboratories, medical equipment, test subjects. The early pictures are of young boys in uniform. The later ones showed prematurely aged men with blank stares. Dan recognized the familiar slumped figure in the 1978 photo. An elderly man in a lab coat stood with his back to the camera. Characteristic posture, scars on his left arm. Raymond Clark, the ranger whose map led him here. Officially dead 3 weeks ago. But this photo is from 1978, 26 years after his brother Dan disappeared. Clark was in his early 30s. He worked here from the beginning. The last document is a color photograph. 6 men in white coats in front of a steel door labeled HANGAR 18, Level 3. In the center is Thomas, aged, gray-haired, but alive. Next to him is Clark, signed Project HANGAR 18, Test #7, July 1978. Approved to proceed to Phase 3. On the back is a note. Subjects are stable. Regeneration confirmed. Aging has been slowed. Mirror protocol activated. Isolation required. Dr. Schmidt. A mechanical clanking sounded in the silence of the tunnel. The lock's red indicator blinked and turned green. The heavy deadbolts pulled away. The door began to open. Bright light poured in from the corridor. The silhouette of a man stepped into the semi-darkness of the tunnel. Dan retreated into the shadows, clutching his brother's photograph. The next second, he recognized the entrant, Raymond Clark, alive and well. "Hello, Daniel," Clark said. "I knew you'd come. Your brother is waiting for you downstairs. It's time to learn the truth about HANGAR 18. Raymond Clark stood in the doorway, alive, though officially dead for 3 weeks. He looked to be in his 60s, his gray hair neatly slicked back, deep wrinkles furrowing his forehead. He wore a white lab coat over an unmarked military uniform. Clark gestured for Dan to follow him. They entered a brightly lit corridor. Bundles of cables and conduits stretched along the walls. Every 10 meters there were steel doors with signs. Some of the rooms had glass windows. Inside they could see lab equipment and blinking instrument indicators. Along the way, Clark told his story, how he'd tried to leave the project in 1972, taken a job as a ranger, hoped to forget, but the past wouldn't let go. He began to notice oddities in the park, unexplained magnetic anomalies, areas of dead vegetation, traces of underground utilities where they shouldn't be. When Clark had gathered enough evidence and was preparing to hand it over to the press, they came for him. They faked an accident, a fall off a cliff. In reality, he was returned to the underground complex. Not as a researcher, but as a prisoner with privileges. They put him in charge of the archives, keeping track of documentation. They descended the metal stairs to the second level. Here, the atmosphere was different. The corridors were wider, the ceilings higher. Along the walls were laboratories with transparent partitions. Behind the glass, Dan could see centrifuges, microscopes, refrigerated chambers with biomaterials. Clark stopped at a door labeled Archive 2. He put his palm to the fingerprint scanner. The mechanism clicked and the heavy door slid aside. The archive room resembled a library. In the center was a desk with a computer terminal. Clark walked over to one of the cabinets and typed in a code on a digital panel. From a drawer, he pulled out a bulky folder. On the cover were black letters, Carter T, Test Subject #7, Active Phase. Inside was Thomas Carter's life history for the past 30 years. Medical records, test results, psychological profiles, charts of health indicators, scans of internal organs. Dan leafed through the pages with growing concern. Early reports had described Thomas as a promising subject with high adaptability. By the mid-60s, there were notes about emotional instability and attempts at unauthorized abandonment. After 1965, the nature of the records changed. They now referred to successful correction of behavioral patterns and optimal integration with the mirror protocol. Medical indicators showed abnormalities, delayed cellular aging, increased tissue regeneration, and changes in DNA structure. Clark explained that Dan's brother was alive and working on level 3 of the complex. After a failed escape attempt, he was subjected to intensive therapy. Thomas's personality had undergone a change. He'd become a different person, dedicated to the project. The way to the third level was through the central lift. The car moved slowly with frequent stops. On each floor, security systems were activated, retinal scans, fingerprint checks, voice analysis. The complex seemed almost deserted. They had not met a single person during the entire descent. Clark explained that the project had been canceled in 1984. Most of the staff had been evacuated. Only key personnel and those who couldn't be let out remained. The lift doors opened on the third level. There was a different atmosphere here. The walls were painted gray, the lighting dimmed. The air was stale, smelling of chemicals and something organic. The corridor stretched for 100 meters. On either side were massive steel doors with small windows made of reinforced glass. Each door had a light above it, either red or green. Clark called these rooms isolation rooms. They held subjects whose bodies reacted unpredictably to the experiments. Some of the doors were welded shut. Behind one of them, something thudded against the walls. At the end of the corridor was a laboratory with transparent walls. Inside, bent over an electron microscope, a man in a white coat was working. Gray hair, slouching shoulders. He didn't turn around when Dan and Clark entered. It wasn't until Clark called his name that the man looked up. Dan recognized his brother immediately. The same facial features, the familiar scar on his chin from falling off his bike as a child. But something was wrong. Thomas's eyes remained blank, without a glimmer of recognition. He looked at Dan like a stranger, assessing and cold. When he spoke, his voice was monotone, emotionless. Thomas listed the project's accomplishments like a memorized lesson. Accelerated tissue regeneration at 4 times the normal rate, slowing the aging process by 70%, resistance to radiation and most known pathogens, increased physical strength and endurance. He then asked Dan for a blood sample, standard procedure for all visitors to level 3. Dan didn't suspect a trick, rolled up his sleeve. The needle entered the vein and dark blood filled the tube. Thomas put the sample into the analyzer, a compact device about the size of a microwave. The machine buzzed, and the data lines ran on the screen. A minute later, a beep sounded. The results were unexpected. The graph on the monitor showed abnormal peaks in certain parts of the genome. Thomas scrutinized the data, then turned to his brother. In an impassive tone, he explained, "Dan is a carrier of a rare genetic mutation, a natural predisposition to the mirror protocol, 1 in a million. That's why he was brought here." Clark turned pale upon hearing those words. Dan demanded an explanation. Thomas continued in the same steady voice. All of the subject's relatives were being monitored. Dan had shown signs in 1981, abnormally fast healing after a car accident, resistance to infection. Serving in the Marine Corps was no accident. It was a test of how the body would react to extreme stress. Dan passed all the tests. Now it was time to activate the latent genes. The realization of the truth struck like a bolt of lightning. His whole life had been an experiment. Every choice, every decision, everything was under control. At that moment, a siren wailed. The red emergency lights flashed under the ceiling. A mechanical voice announced the start of the isolation protocol. Thomas calmly walked over to the terminal on the wall, entered the code, explained. He was activating the sweep system. In 15 minutes, the lower level would be flooded. Then the water will come up here. Total destruction of all traces of the project. Clark rushed for the exit, but the massive bulkheads were already lowering, cutting off escape routes. Somewhere down below, powerful pumps were running. Water rumbled through the pipes. Thomas opened the metal case that stood on the lab table. Inside, ampules of greenish liquid lay in special slots, a concentrated mirror serum, the culmination of 30 years of research. He explained to his brother a single injection would activate dormant genes. Dan would become the same, enhanced, virtually immortal. Emotions would disappear, but that was a small price to pay for perfection. Water began to seep under the lab door. Puddles formed on the floor. It was only minutes away from complete flooding. Thomas held out a syringe of serum to his brother. The choice was simple: take the injection or die with the sinking base. The water was rising fast. Already it covered the floor of the laboratory with a layer of 10 centimeters, cold and murky. The emergency lights were coloring it red. Dan stood in front of his brother, clutching a syringe of greenish liquid in his hand. Time seemed to stop. Memories flashed through his mind. How Thomas had taught him to ride a bike, protected him from the older kids in the yard, read him adventure novels at bedtime. Now there was a different man in front of him, cold, calculating, devoid of emotion. Thomas looked at him like a laboratory specimen, waiting for a decision. Dan searched his brother's eyes for a shadow of the old man. He tried to remind himself of the past, of his mother, who waited until the last minute for her eldest son's return, of their joint hikes in the mountains, of their vow to always protect each other. Thomas listened without emotion. His voice remained mechanical as he repeated the benefits of the serum: longevity, immunity to disease, superhuman abilities. The price, just emotions and memories. Clark, meanwhile, was working at the control panel in the far corner of the lab. The water was already up to his knees. The old ranger had opened the security panel, trying to reach the emergency systems. He found an opportunity, an old technical airlock in the southern sector, built back in the 50s as an emergency exit for personnel. But the system had been shut down decades ago. Clark connected the bare wires, trying to power the mechanism. Sparks sputtered from the panel. A flash illuminated the lab. The discharge passed through the old man's body, throwing him back against the wall. Dan rushed to him, but it was too late. Charred clothes, the smell of burnt flesh. Clark was still breathing, but he had only seconds to live. His lips moved, giving out his last words about the airlock in the southern sector. The water rose to his waist. Dan turned back to the panel. The circuitry had been partially damaged by the discharge, but the main connections were intact. Power had to be restored, and the access code entered. Thomas watched his attempts with scientific interest, commented on the chances of success, less than 5%, suggested a more rational solution: take the serum. Dan worked feverishly. The water reached his chest, making it difficult to move. His fingers were numb with cold. Finally, the indicator light on the panel turned green. The system had come to life. But the joy was premature. Activating the gateway required a biometric key, the palm print of an authorized employee. Clark's dead. Thomas refused to help. That left only one option. Dan looked at the syringe in his hand. A partial dose might give him the strength to survive underwater, to make it to the airlock. But what would be left of his identity? He thought back to his service in the Marines, the comrades he lost in Lebanon, his oath to protect his country and its citizens. If he took this dose and became like Thomas, who would tell the truth about what was happening here? Dan stared at the syringe in his hand. The greenish liquid promised salvation, but at what cost? He turned to his brother, searching his eyes for a shadow of doubt. Nothing, just cold calculation. The decision came suddenly. Dan dropped the syringe to the floor and rushed over to Clark's body. The water was already up to his chest, making it difficult to move. He grabbed the dead ranger's hand, dragging it to the control panel. Dan pressed Clark's palm against the scanner. The second of waiting seemed like an eternity. The indicator flashed red, then again. On the third time, a green signal. The system had accepted the print. The mechanism was working. Somewhere in the depths of the complex, servos hummed. Dan rushed for the exit, leaving his brother in the flooded laboratory. Thomas made no attempt to follow him, only watched with the same detached curiosity. The water was rising fast. Dan ducked, swam through the opening. The emergency lights were out, so he had to navigate by feel. His lungs burned from lack of oxygen. The corridor led him to the technical airlock. The old wheel did not give way immediately. He was running out of energy, and his consciousness was beginning to fade. With a final effort, Dan turned the mechanism. Water rushed into the opening, carrying him down the vertical shaft. The metal steps hurt his hands, but he climbed upwards, clinging with all his might. Finally, a hatch to the surface. Dan pushed it open with his shoulder and fell out onto the sand. The dawn sun was blinding, his lungs gulping for air. Dawn colored the dunes pink. The desert looked the same as it always did, serene, eternal. There was no sign of the underground complex. Only a small dip in the sand marked the spot where the ventilation entrance had been. Dan lay on the warm sand, looking up at the sky. His body ached from the bruises, his lungs burning from lack of oxygen. But he was alive, and still human. The following weeks passed like a blur. The official investigation wrote Clark's disappearance off as an accident. There was no mention of the underground base. Military patrols stepped up security in the western sector, but only formally because of increased poaching. Dan went back to work as a ranger. His colleagues noticed the change. He became quieter, avoided company. They blamed it on the stress of losing his partner. Only Dan knew the truth. By day, he patrolled the park, performing routine duties. At night, he'd return to where the entrance to the compound was. He listened to the sounds underground. Sometimes he thought he could hear generators running, pumps pumping. The physical injuries healed quickly, but the psychological scars remained. Nightmares haunted him every night. Flooded corridors, a dead Clark, his brother's empty eyes. Sometimes, looking out over the white dunes, he would see a silhouette with gray hair on the horizon. The figure would appear for a second and then disappear. In the breeze, he could hear his brother's voice repeating formulas and numbers. The dreams became vivid, almost tangible. In them, he was back in the lab, again facing a choice. He woke up in a cold sweat, unsure if he was in reality. A month after the incident, Dan received a letter with no return address. Inside was a picture of a group of scientists at the entrance to Hangar 18 and a note, "The project is not complete. We are watching." He burned the letter, but the message was clear. He's being watched. Perhaps he was part of a new experiment, living proof of the success of the Mirror program. Dan continued to work in the park, patrolling the dunes every day, keeping an eye out for tourists, filling out reports. But now he had another mission, to protect the secret of Angara 18, to keep the curious out of the danger zone. Sometimes, in rare moments of peace, he thought of his brother. Was Thomas alive? Had he managed to get out, or had the base become his grave? There were no answers, only the white dunes stretching to the horizon, and the silence of a desert that held its secrets. Friends, you've just heard the story of Hangar 18 in the White Sands Desert. The story of a ranger who was searching for his missing brother, but found something more, a secret Cold War project. Dan Carter made his choice to reject the mirror serum and remain human. But how many more such objects are hidden underground? And most importantly, is the project really closed? After all, someone keeps sending letters with no return address. Someone is watching. Maybe right now, while you are listening to this story, somewhere in the underground laboratories, continue experiments to create the perfect man. And are we ready to meet those who have already undergone this transformation? Write in the comments, what would you choose, to remain human or to become something more?